Hello, everybody at Trans-mutation. This is Rob Hopkins speaking to you from the southwest of England, and I'm really thrilled to be able to offer some reflections on imagination to your event. So, yeah, I'm going to speak for kind of 20-30 minutes or something, and I really hope it'll be a useful contribution. I'm going to share my screen because I want to show you some pictures. And the question that I want to explore with you today is, what if the next 10 years felt like a revolution of the imagination? It feels to me like one of the most vitally important questions we can be asking right now, because we are in a climate and ecological emergency, which frankly is absolutely terrifying. And if you're not regularly terrified about the climate and ecological emergency, I would suggest that you're not paying attention, that you should look a lot closer at what is happening, because the speed at which this is moving, the recent IPCC report said that it is now unequivocal that human activity is the driver of the changes that we're seeing. We are seeing the most appalling heat waves. We saw recently in Germany the most terrifying floods. This is accelerating around the world, and it's accelerating because we are still addicted to fossil fuels. We are still addicted to a way of living which is completely inconsistent with life being able to be sustained and thrive on this planet. And sometimes when people talk about climate change and about the climate emergency, they tend to talk about it as if it's just a kind of a problem that needs some technical fixes. We need to just change a few economic metrics. We just need to go to electric cars and everything will be fine. It's far too late for that. And the changes that need to be made now are deep and really huge. And the way I like to think about where we are today is like this. You can think of where we are in the global north as being like standing on top of a mountain. And from the top of this mountain, the views are spectacular, more than anybody has ever had before, maybe in human history. And the mountain beneath our feet is made of more carbon, more plastic, more CO2, more debt, more inequality, more anxiety than we've ever stood on top of before. And too often, I think, the discussion about what we do next tends to be framed around the idea that where we are now is somehow irreplaceable, that the world we've created in 2021 is completely non-negotiable. And I think we have to really shift that. So we're not talking about what we're moving away from, but we're refocusing on what we're moving to. And so if we think of it as being like a mountain, and there we are on top of this mountain, the guides who are with us, who know this mountain, are saying, can you see the storm clouds that are coming? We need to get down off this mountain really fast. And for some of us, that's okay. That's enough. They're the guides. They're the experts. They know the mountain, right? For a lot of people, that doesn't seem to be working. And I wonder whether we need to actually work a lot harder to tell the stories of the lower valleys at the bottom of this mountain, the lower slopes of this mountain, and the delicious food that awaits us there, the amazing wine, the really comfortable beds, the warm firesides, the dry socks that wait for us when we come down off this mountain. Because then our work is not about trying to terrify people with statistics. It's about cultivating longing in a society. How do we cultivate a longing for a low carbon world, a world in which we can actually thrive? And one of the beautiful things about that is that cultivating longing is not the work of statistics and policy. It's the work of imagination. It's the work of storytelling. When Dr. Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham, he wrote it because he was challenged by his publisher. Just used 50 words. That was his palette with which to paint. He always said it was the most imaginative thing he ever did, writing that book, because the imagination loves limits. When you put limits around something, we're able to be so much more imaginative. It's why when you study improvisation, they will say, okay, now you are a bus driver and you are trying to get home because it's your child's birthday party and you are whatever. And you create this scenario, you put limits around the imagination can thrive. I travel all over Europe visiting people who are doing transition where they live. And everywhere I go, it is the people who understand the reality of the situation that we are in, who are so much more imaginative than the people who somehow imagine that we can just pretend climate change isn't happening, that fossil fuels will go on forever, who are often the people with the most profoundly poor imaginations that you would. My concern is that in 2021, we are living in a time of imaginative poverty. We're living in a time where we have created the perfect conditions for the contraction of our shared imagination. As Mariame Kaba, an incredible prison abolitionist campaigner in the US, puts it, we live in a system that has locked into a false sense of inevitability. And as Saidiya Hartman put it recently, so much of the work of oppression is about policing the imagination. One person I interviewed for the book talked about the Trump disimagination machine. This idea that we live surrounded by a perfect storm of factors that are corrosive and toxic to our ability to live an imaginative life is really compelling, I think. And that is happening at the worst possible time in history. We are seeing imagination being driven out of our education system. No art, no creativity, pass the tests, pass the tests. In England, we have children taking days off school from stress at the age of 4. The imagination in our private lives, in our work lives, in our education lives, in our political lives is under attack. And a muscle which should be like that because our survival depends on it is much more like this. And that's really, really serious. And I wonder if actually the danger is that we may end up being a civilization for whom the epitaph on our headstone is really, it wasn't that hard. It's not impossible to imagine a world where human societies thrive and we use a fraction of the fossil fuels that we use today. Yes, it'll mean we need to rethink our education system, our health system, our transport system, our food system. And we can either look at that and go, oh, really? Or we can look at that and go, great, it's fantastic, how exciting. And if we can approach it with that, with a yes and mindset rather than a yes but mindset, we can do extraordinary things. And one of the ways that we need to cultivate longing is with art. This is a guy called James Mackay at the University of Leeds who draws the future. This is his drawing of a city that is now has brought back the biodiversity. What would it be like? How can we imagine what the world would be like if we created the best conditions for biodiversity to flourish? This picture really, really helps. Art can allow us to unlock that. In many cities now, cars are being taken out of the fabric of the city, which frees up so much space. What do we do with that space? Maybe we turn it into gardens like this, and our children walk to school down streets full of food being grown. We have to be able to imagine it before we can build it. It's not possible otherwise. And at the moment, I think many people look into the future of a low carbon future. They can't imagine anything. And we need to fill that space with possibilities and ideas and dreams. And all too often, when we walk down the streets in the places that we live and that we know, it's hard to see them as being anything other than what they are now. And if anything, COVID really should have given us the opportunity and the space to completely rethink. This is Fleet Street in London, which looks like this. You would be entirely forgiven as you walk down this street for thinking, well, it'll always be like this. This is a little animation made by a campaign group in London, which I really love. Once you've seen Fleet Street like this, and you see those possibilities, and you look at that space in a different way, and then you expand that imagination out, and you say, what if every street in London, what would this unlock for the work people did? How would this change the mental health situation, the public health situation? You start to be able to lay stories on top of that, which are hugely liberating. And you might be thinking at this point, well, yeah, but in the real world, Rob, that kind of thing just doesn't happen. Actually, it does. And this is an amazing town I visited in France called Montsartou. It's about half an hour inland from Nice. And the municipality there were told by the French government that they needed to make 20% of all the food in local schools organic. And in Montsartou, they said, well, if 20% is better than 0%, why do we stop at 20%? Let's just do 100%. So the municipality bought some land that was going to be developed for housing, for like luxury housing, and instead they turned it into a food garden. And they now grow 70% of all the food for all the schools in the town. And what they found was a massive shift in how families at the school bought food and where they bought it from. 60% of families who before never bought organic food started to buy organic food. And you can look at a project like this and you can see something that is a win-win, win-win-win-win scenario. It's good for public health, mental health, biodiversity, local economy, education, etc., etc., etc. You know, and so many of the solutions that we find for the climate emergency are like this. So this is what I want to bring to transmutation. It is a model that we call the imagination sundial. The idea of the imagination sundial is an attempt that came out of some conversations with myself and a friend called Rob Shorter. Say, okay, if we're living in 2021 at a time where our collective imagination is shrinking and we need our collective imagination to expand, what might we do? Where do we start? So there's 4 different things, and I'm going to go through each of these and tell you some stories. So the first one is space. You all know that the time when your imagination is at its most vibrant is when you have space, when your imagination has space. You don't get your best ideas when you are really anxious and stressed and overwhelmed. It needs space. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he rode his bicycle in the forest. So as communities, we need to make that kind of space too. This is an event that we ran in my town just before COVID, where we brought everybody together to ask what if, and to say, you know, where do we go next in terms of the climate emergency here? And these kind of spaces are so important. We also need to look at universal basic income and a 4-day working week as being national imagination strategies, because the right to live an imaginative life is not distributed evenly across our society. This is a transition group in London, Transition Tooting, who created something called a Tooting Transition Shop. They took over an empty shop, they ran it for 2 months as a place where you could just go and have a conversation, talk to people. It was beautifully facilitated, talk to people about what do you hope for the future, what do you love about your place, what do you know, it was just beautifully facilitated, gathered in people's conversations. And this kind of space where people can come together and be facilitated to think about the future in different ways are really, really vital to this. Second one is place. This is Waterloo Bridge in London in April 2019. And I'm recording this on the day that the 2021 Extinction Rebellion has started in London. My wife is there. She's very actively involved. Theme for this year, very appropriately to this talk, is Demand the Impossible. Imagination slogans from the student revolution in 1968. What they did in April 2019, they took Waterloo Bridge, they blocked it at both ends with hundreds of people, and they held that bridge for almost 2 weeks. And during that time, they turned it into a forest. They put trees all down the middle, and people who walk over that bridge every day, normally very polluted, got to experience being on that bridge as if it was a forest. And it really moved people. People would stop and say, oh, why can't it be like this every day? And if we can take places that people know really well and use them to give people a taste of how the future could be, that's really, really powerful. This is in Houston, Texas, where a friend of mine called Jason Roberts runs a project called Better Block. Better Block goes to places like this. Nobody loves this place. Nobody really cares about this place. They go to all the people around and say, what does this place need? What do you long for? And then they go back to their lab and they build things. And one day, just when it's getting dark, they turn up. And by the next day, they've turned that place in. They fill it with conversation and conviviality and community. I like to think of it as a kind of a pop-up tomorrow. They give people a taste in 2021 of what the future could be like. That kind of experience is really powerful for people. It doesn't have to always be on that scale. This is something called Parking Day that started in San Francisco with a group of artists who wanted to find exhibition space. Not very easy in San Francisco. And then someone said, well, if you buy a ticket for a car parking space, is there a rule that says you have to put a car in it? So they started to think of car parking spaces as low cost rent space for doing different things. And then once a year, they have an event called Parking Day, where loads of people come down and they all buy loads of parking tickets and they fill those spaces with gardens and sculptures and little cafes and libraries and all sorts of things. It's a beautiful, again, this idea of a kind of pop-up tomorrow. Sometimes places like this is Princess Innengarten in which is one of the most visited urban agriculture projects in the world. Things like this, where you go and afterwards, when you go back to where you came from, you look at its possibilities in really different ways. It's really hard to visit Princess Innengarten and then come back to where you live and not walk around it, seeing food gardens everywhere. It's a bit like when you go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. You come out afterwards and you walk around in the world, everywhere looks like a Van Gogh painting. And it's the same with somewhere like Princess Innengarten. You know, we need those places that shift our sense of what's possible in the world. And sometimes those places can be whole towns. This is a place in France called Ungersheim, which is an amazing demonstration of transition in action. They have amazing renewable energy projects, massive local food production, which feeds local schools, a building which processes that food to create more jobs, a local currency called the radish. They have a straw bale co-housing project. They have all sorts of stuff with a really visionary mayor called Jean-Claude Mensch, who has sort of drawn this story together and harnessed the energy of local people to make it happen. And there was a film called Qu'est-ce qu'on attend, made by a French filmmaker called Marie-Monique Robin, which has been shown all over France. And this little town and its story, this place, has inspired so many people to think differently. And your place could do exactly the same. Your neighborhood, your building, your university, your business, your town could exactly be the same kind of inspiring place for other people. Third one I want to share with you is practices. And what I mean by practices is things we do together that allow us to expand our shared imagination, our radical imagination, our collective longing for a different future. It's really important to start by recognizing that imagination is not evenly distributed. To see things as if they could be otherwise is not evenly distributed across society. This is a really important part of your brain called the hippocampus. It's kind of in the middle, and it has two halves. It's like the wishing bone of a chicken, and it's where your imagination and your memory both fire from. And the thing that's really interesting about it is it is the part of the brain that is particularly vulnerable to cortisol, the hormone produced when we are anxious. And when that happens, when we are in stress or trauma or high levels of anxiety, the hippocampus can shrink by up to 20%. And when that happens, we lose the ability to think about the future in hopeful and positive ways, and we get stuck in the present, we get stuck in the past. So I wanted to find a place that was intentionally trying to expand the hippocampus. How do you do that? I don't know. I went to Dundee to an amazing project called Art Angel, run by Rosalie Somerton here. And they work with people with mental health problems, burnout. And they say, when you come here, you're not a patient or a client, you're an artist, and you are preparing work for an exhibition. And that's what they do. And so I spoke to so many people there who were just really happy to tell me their stories about how it had transformed their lives, how they were able to see the future again for the first time. It was really powerful. And I really got a sense of what it feels like for people when the hippocampus starts to grow back again. I said to Rosalie, how do you do this? She said, we create a place of safety and hope. Two things which are massively lacking in society for far too many people right now. And every year at Archangel, to evaluate how well they're doing, they give their artist a piece of paper with two silhouette outlines of a human body. And they say, fill the first one to show how you felt before you came here, and the second to show how you feel now that you've been coming here for a while. And I looked through a big pile of these. It was very moving. Oh, excuse me. Looked through a big pile of these. It was very, very moving. And here's one that really, really struck me, and it needs very little explanation, I think. So when I look at this picture, firstly, I see what it looks like, what it feels like actually more when your hippocampus starts to grow back again. Secondly, I get a sense of what it would look like as a society to have our hippocampus re-expand. And thirdly, I look at this and I think, if we are to do everything that the climate scientists tell us we need to do and make cuts in carbon on the scale that we have to, it will feel like this. This is what it would feel like to live through a revolution of the imagination. As Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left. The only solutions we have are radical and deeply transformative. And to live through a time where we are actually getting on with that, with the cultivation of longing, with political purpose and ambition, what would that feel like? It would feel like this. This is the picture that gets me out of bed every morning to do the work that I do. So another practice is the one that's been developed in the transition movement. This is something called Transition Town Anywhere. And Transition Town Anywhere is where you bring together between 100 and 400 people, you need a big space, and you start by imagining that you travel through time, 2021 to 2030. The 2030 that you arrive into, it's not paradise or utopia. It's the result of us having done everything we possibly could have done. It's the result of us having lived through something that felt like a revolution of the imagination. And then you think about, well, what am I doing in that world? What's my role? What's my business? What am I doing? And then you find other people who share that interest, and you design a project, and then you build it, literally, with cardboard, string, newspaper, sticky tape. You live it, you build it, you live in it, you inhabit it. It's one of the most phenomenal things I've ever been part of. To be with 300 adults totally lost in a play world of their imagining is just magical. This was the last time we did it. This might look to you like some chairs and some. These two young men have built the public transport system for Transition Town Anywhere. They can tell you everything about it, what the seats are made out of, what noise it makes, what color the tickets are, where it goes. And the poet Rilke once said something like, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And activities like this can allow that to happen, can allow the future to enter into us. I want to tell you a couple of stories about another practice, which is the ability to ask really good what-if questions. I feel like the ability to ask really good what-if questions is one of the great skills we need to master. In London, Transition Town Tooting in South London said, we don't have anywhere here that's like a village green or a town square or a kind of a place for the people. We don't have it. And so, but they said, this is where we could have one. It's currently a bus turning circle full of buses. They leave their engines running, waiting to be called to go somewhere. It's a pretty horrible place. So in Tooting, they said that could be our village green. They organized an event called the Tooting Twirl. They crowdfunded £2,000. They took that space one Sunday afternoon in July. They turned it into what it would be like if it already was the village green. They filled it with food and conversation and coffee and flowers and carnival. They put real grass down on the ground. They invited the real diversity of that neighborhood. I got to sit with my feet on the green grass of Tooting on a Sunday afternoon in the sunshine. It was fantastic. And what was most powerful about it was that I noticed as the day went on, that the conversations started to change. They started out as, if this was our village green, and by about the middle of the day, they started to change to, when this is our village green. The sense of possibility shifted underneath. It was amazing. I heard people say, when this is our village green, what story about ourselves do we want to paint on that wall, on the wall of Primark, which nobody would ever normally look at? Green, that would be a really important piece of wall. So it moved from if to when in a way that was fascinating to see. And this is in Liège in Belgium, where the transition group in Liège started a project called Ceinture Alimentaire, which means food belt. And it came about because they started asking the question, what if in a generation's time, the majority of the food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? A beautiful question. I love it. And they ran a big event. They invited everyone who cared about food. I went to that event. It was amazing. And then I went home, and 4 years later, I went back to Liège. And in that time in Liège, they've started 25 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros of investment to fund those cooperatives, not from the bank, from local people, investing in those cooperatives. They started vineyards, a brewery, a farm, shops, small producers where they sell food from local farmers. Then it's now the model that is being used to change how the city's universities, hospitals, and schools procure food. It's phenomenal. I met the mayor who said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. You know, you could see the story a city tells about itself starting to shift because they got the what if question right to underpin the whole thing. And I've loved seeing during lockdown the number of communities who are using what if as the framing for thinking about where do we go from here. This is a Cornwall who every day for a month before I gave a talk for them posted a different what if. What if car parks became playgrounds? What if birdsong drowned out the sound of the traffic? What if cyclists were given? What if there was a daily imagination lesson? This was the last one, which I loved. This was on the very last day, and they didn't even need to put all the writing "what if" anymore. People understood the idea. But what it captured for me was something about conviviality and community and connection. And our current neoliberal capitalist model is set up to sell us things that give us pleasure. Things that are there and then they're gone again, and you need it again, which is why when you're the more dependent you become on that sort of thing, the more you see a rise in anxiety and depression and addiction. Whereas actually a culture oriented towards happiness and contentment would be very different. And for me, that's what this picture speaks to. It allows us to feel into a future that is about happiness. This is in London, in Camden, where Transition Town, Kentish Transition Town, and the local Extinction Rebellion group and the local municipality, who were the first to declare a climate emergency and the first to do a citizens' assembly on climate change, took over in our old cafe and turned it into what they called Think and Do, which was a kind of community imagining space, a community what-if space, where they invited people to bring in their ideas and stories about what they'd like the future to be like. And it was open for a couple of months, and it was amazing. One of the things they did afterwards was they gathered up all the stories people had told about what 2030 would be like, as if they were already there, and they produced a newspaper. They produced a 100-page document of all of these stories, and then one week they took over the front 4 pages of their local newspaper and turned it into a newspaper from the future. Again, the future must enter into you a long time. So the last one that I want to share with you before I wrap up is pacts. What I mean by pact is a weird word to use in relation to the imagination, right? This is a story from Bologna in Italy. So here, the municipality noticed a real decline in engagement and participation in elections and in civic life, really. There was a real gap opening up. So they started something called the Civic Imagination Office, not a civic participation office or a civic engagement office. It was a civic imagination office. And they opened 6 laboratories around the city, and they would run big events like this, big visioning open space events, getting people together to dream what kind of future they'd like. And then when they'd come up with a good idea, the municipality would sit with them and say, that's a great idea. Okay, how do we make that a reality? We can offer this, this, and this. You can offer that. Good. Let's make a pact. And in the last 5 years in Bologna, they've made 500 pacts, ranging from we're going to make a new garden on this street to we're going to take over this empty office block and turn it into a school to train young people as classical musicians. It's just fantastic. And I think in a time when our experience tends to be that there is no space made for the imagination, there is no value placed on the imagination in most of our work lives, certainly in our children's education, in our political lives, both locally and nationally and internationally. The imagination is kind of pushed to one side, belittled, humiliated, ignored. And we need to create things like pacts which allow us to start to draw imagination up through a society. Mariana Mazzucato, in the book that she recently wrote, a time of crisis is exactly the moment to reimagine what type of society we want to build and the capabilities and capacities we need to get us there. We need to see a revolution of the imagination, and we need to create the best conditions for that. We need, as some people now are starting to say, we need to build an imagination infrastructure in the same way that we build a telecommunications infrastructure, a roads traffic infrastructure. We need to build an imagination infrastructure in every country that really values and appreciates the imagination. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I will give a link where you don't need to be squinting at all the tiny writing around the side. I'll give a link where you can download a high-resolution version of this, which has more examples. And just to finish, I wanted to say about the transition movement. So I'm one of the people who started the transition movement. It's now been running for 14 years or something, 15 years. And you can now find transition groups active in 50 world. 26 countries now have what we call a national hub, which supports transition in that country. There are thousands of places where this is happening. And what they do is we talk about it as being a movement of communities who are reimagining and rebuilding the world. They start with small projects like planting some trees or making food gardens, to more ambitious things like a local currency, to really ambitious things like community energy companies, the kind of work they're doing in Liège. All of it really matters because it gives people a taste in 2021 of what that 2030 could be like in a way that they can interact with it and meet it and see it and get excited about it, and that it's about creating longing because you've seen something, you know it works because you've seen it. So for me, the transition movement is so fundamentally important because it creates a space where people can step in and create what if spaces and hold what if spaces, have the conversations that matter, and then without waiting for anyone's permission, get on and create those things. It's really, really powerful and really very important. So if you want to find out more about that, have a look at transitionnetwork.org. There's a great resource there called The Essential Guide to Doing Transition that has everything you need to get started where you are. If you want to find out more about what I do, have a look at robhopkins.net. And I do a podcast series called From What If to What Next, which every fortnight explores a different what if question. You'll find it on most good podcast places. But if you subscribe, you get them the moment they're released, and you get a bonus episode as well called The Ministry of Imagination. If you've been inspired by this, or if you've read From What Is to What If, then I think you'll find that really useful too. So thank you so much for allowing me to share some of these ideas with you at Trans-mutation. I hope the rest of the event has been great. All the other speakers that I've heard about sound fantastic too. So enjoy the rest of your conference. And as the student revolutionaries in May 1968 would have said, power to the imagination. Thank you very much.